Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back at CoMotion. It's great to see everyone here today. I'm excited for this next panel that we have, talking about one of my favorite topics, autonomous vehicles and our future. So I want to first start by introducing our wonderful panel. So joining us today is Renee. She is the Global Director of Industry Strategy at Hayden AI, an exciting company that we're going to learn more about today. Next, we have Tyler Duvall. Tyler is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Cavnu, and we'll hear more about the work that they're doing. And last but not least is Karina. She is the FTA Associate Administrator for the Federal Transit Administration. Senator Jeff Brandes will also be joining us shortly, and so as soon as he gets here, he's going to join us on stage. Okay, everyone. So I'm excited to get into this. I want to start by posing a question to the entire panel. It's a little bit of a softball, but I think given your various perspectives, I'd love for you to answer. What is the most exciting thing or the compelling thing that brings you to this work when we talk about this autonomous future? So Renee, I want to start with you.
I'll actually start, and thanks for a softball. So the reason that I started working in technology in the first place is because I had a role in a government agency that paid for a technology product that they weren't happy with, that didn't solve their problem because they didn't fully understand what they were buying. And I thought, there's tremendous amounts of money being spent in the future of transportation and artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles, and I would like for that money to be spent in a useful way that actually helps government do its job. So that's the reason I joined Hayden a few months ago. We'll get into that, but to me it's more, how can technology help us do things that we could never do before?
Awesome. So Tyler, I'm really excited to learn more about your project. We're going to get into that. But I kind of want to hear your answer in particular, because what you're working on is a huge piece, and that's actually the infrastructure. But what brings you to this work, and what excites you the most about it?
Yeah, so look, there's no silver bullet solution in any policy arena, but when it comes to transportation, you have these kind of three-headed failures of safety, congestion, environmental performance, and we just have frankly really crummy performance across all dimensions, frankly around the world, but certainly in the United States. And so when I spent 20 years in the transportation arena and started to kick around this idea with the founders of Cavnu around basically an intervention on the infrastructure side to unlock autonomous vehicles, I started to say that's the missing link. This is the solution that ultimately will address all three of these major public policy failures. And so I fell in love with the topic of transportation, and then when I started to think about a company that could partner with government, and I come out of the government, I worked as a management consultant, and I finally said, you know what, I want to go actually solve the problem from the company side in partnership with government. And our companies, we'll talk about the project in Michigan, but our basic model is to do long-term partnerships, kind of a next generation partnership model, not a privatization model, but a partnership to deploy technology to address those three basic failures. And I have a strong belief that autonomous vehicles are going to really transform the world, hopefully in a positive way. But if we don't, in the public sector side, intervene, it's going to be some negative outcomes.
Excellent. Karina, would love to hear from you.
Sure. So, we're in a moment right now where we have an administration who is really laser focused on four basic tenets. One is that we need to improve safety. We just released the National Roadway Safety Strategy. 40,000 people lose their lives on our roads every year. It's 40,000 families that are robbed of someone that they love. We need to address this. It's a critical and urgent threat, and we need to take a holistic, whole of government approach to addressing safety. Equity, we've have legacy of racial disparities, economic disparities, communities that have been systemically left behind, rural communities, tribal communities, who really have not been able to reach their full economic potential. And we really need to redress some of those systemic and historic failures that we've had. We need to address the climate challenge. We've got 8 years, is what the scientists tell us, that before we really start tripping over that point where communities like South Florida will start to see some significant impacts. And so we really need to address that. And then there's the issue of American competitiveness and really positioning ourselves in the global marketplace, being a leader across that. And in those crossroads, right at the heart of that, is public transportation. You can't achieve, I would contend, any one of those objectives without really high quality, high performing, high utilized public transportation. And yet, public transportation has been losing its market share over the last several decades. And so we really need to redefine what public transportation is, redefine how that is providing a public service, and really meet people where they're at with the needs that they have. And we really think that done right, with proper guidance, proper investment, autonomous vehicle technology can help us reach those 4 imperatives and really move us toward addressing those goals.
Thanks, Karina. Both Tyler and I are US DOT alums, and I got to tell you, the way that you sort of talked about those issues, at least during my time there, we didn't discuss autonomous vehicles at all, but we also didn't talk about some of the overlapping issues that you just highlighted. So I want to get into a little bit of that later, but first, I want to hear from Senator Brandis. It's great to have you on this panel today here, sir. I see you, and you look mild-mannered, and what I mean by that is the senator is a hero of this industry here in Florida. He really took a leadership role in autonomous vehicle from a policy perspective and from a legislative perspective. And so, normally when you're on the state at the state legislature, you've got your cape on, representing the AV industry and the concerns of your constituents. With that being said, would love to hear from you about what has excited you the most about the industry? Why did you decide to take on AV and the issue of AVs and ensuring that Florida was a hub for autonomous vehicle testing and deployment? What motivated you to do that?
Great to be with you, first of all. Thank you so much. So I was first elected in 2010 with a really talented class in the Florida House. And I had just previous to that spent 11 years in the military. Spent 2003, 2004 in Iraq with 101st. As a transportation officer, drove over 75 combat convoys throughout Iraq. And I was part of this really talented class and was trying to figure out what was the one big idea in every area of public policy. And so I thought, how do I quickly find out with a big idea? And so I started watching TED Talks, because I think that's like a condensed version of how to find the big ideas. And luckily I had a 4-hour drive from my house in St. Pete up to Tallahassee, so I could cover a lot of TED Talks between St. Pete and Tallahassee. So I came across Sebastian Thrun's discussion on self-driving cars, was captivated, probably watched that video 10 times on that trip, and thought this is the big idea. Had a legislative aide I talked to. He said, you can't do this. People will think you're insane. Nobody in the country is talking about self-driving cars. Don't do that. So I got a new legislative aide who wasn't as good as talking me out of things, and decided to work on self-driving vehicles. Reached out to Google, because they were the only people in the town doing it, and said, hey, Google, I'm really interested in working on self-driving cars. They told me no. I called them back 3 weeks later. I said, hey, listen, I'm going to do this anyways, so I hope I don't screw it up. Sorry. They called me back 48 hours later and said, you have access to our team. We're going to bring cars. Here's our legal team. And we're going to make sure and help you not screw this up. So Florida became really the second state behind Arizona, and really the first legislative lead behind in the country to work on this. While I was in Iraq, I read this book called Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And so I said, well, how would a libertarian think about regulating self-driving vehicles? And what you come to find out is nobody in government actually wants to be responsible for declaring a vehicle safe. And so if nobody in government wants to do that, how do we create a proxy for safety? And in Florida, what we've done is create a proxy for safety by saying, if you carry $1 million worth of insurance from an approved vendor, an approved insurance company, then we consider that as safe, and therefore we consider that as acceptable to operate on Florida's roads. What that does is it keeps out the riffraff. You can't put a brick on a lawnmower and say it's a self-driving vehicle and just drive it around. Like, a legitimate company is ultimately going to back these companies and back the safety thing. But what that does is it cuts out all the regulatory hurdles. It doesn't have some one person in Florida who's trying to decipher lines of code and determine a vehicle safe. And it's a reason why Florida has really become a bastion for self-driving in the country, and why we have Argo operating here, Starsky was operating here, Voyage was operating here for a long time. And we know that there's other companies coming. Two Simple's here, and other companies are here now. But really excited about where Florida is. We really are a central node. Obviously, no snow, so we get to cheat on that hard problem. Relatively good roads because we don't have snow. We don't dig up our roads every couple of years. And it's a newer community. And I think the other thing that really is this isn't a new conversation for our state. We've been talking about this for a decade. And so really excited about where we are. And while we're not as far as I thought we would be a decade ago when I started working on this, I've really come to believe that 2010 to 2020 was the decade of the shared economy, where you had Uber, Lyft, DoorDash. 2020 to 2030 will be the decade of electrification, and 2030 and beyond will be the decade of automation. And I think you're going to see automation really take place in three major areas. First, it's going to be port operations, agriculture, and long-haul trucking.
Wow, thank you for that, Senator. You know what, Karina, I want to go to you for a second, and I want you to sort of remove your FTA cap and go back to your days running things for Pittsburgh. Based on what Senator Brandis talked about in terms of his motivation for the policy work in Florida, I would love for you to share with us just the perspective of someone from a city and their approach to autonomous vehicle testing and deployment. Now, when the idea of AVs testing on the streets of Pittsburgh first arrived on your desk, what were some of the things that you were thinking? What were some of the motivation behind your work in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, so Mayor Peduto at the time famously said some words that he maybe wished that he could call back a little bit, which said, we can either roll out the red tape or roll out the red carpet for this kind of testing. Maybe we didn't roll out the red carpet so much, but what we found was by working with the industry, by working with the technologists, that we could really define the use cases that we were trying to solve for. And the use case was not how does a person of choice have even more choices available in the ways that they were traveling around, but the use cases that we were seeking was how do the people of limited choices, how do people with mobility impairments, how do people with income challenges, how do, we love bicycling and all kinds of micromobility, but if you're a parent with a school-aged child, or if you're someone traveling with a couple of groceries, bags of groceries, these kinds of things are more difficult to do in these other models. Transit, again, is the preferred choice, but transit isn't always there at the moment that you want it. That last mile from where the high-frequency transit is to the front door of your home. In Pittsburgh, your front door of your home is probably up a 30-degree slope. So really wanting to figure out how do we fill that market gap, not just how do we continue to facilitate this industry just adding more to where there's a rich and robust market, but how do we, by offering up the city as a test bed and providing this thing that was very, very valuable and desired by the industry, how do we then also ask something of the industry, which was, we need you to help us problem solve for these issues. We had some successes, we had some challenges. One of the things that we really wanted was transparency, which the industry is not great at. But that at least brought us into a conversation and helped facilitate discussions between community, people who are working on social issues in the community, with the technologists who are trying to deploy these.
Thank you for that. That's invaluable to hear. I want to go back to you, Renee. We talked with the senator and we talked with Karina about sort of the history, right, in their prospective markets. I'd love to focus on sort of the future and this exciting company, Hayden AI. One of the things that was exciting to hear about was your focus on cities. So could you share a little bit more about what Hayden does and its vision for the future of autonomous traffic management?
Sure, absolutely, thanks. So what Hayden has done is bring a team of engineers who were working on autonomous vehicle technology and all of the hyper-localized mapping and SLAM technology that comes along with that, and said, what is something that we could do today to fix a problem that we know exists? And so the use case that we're focused on right now is bus lane and dedicated bus stop enforcement. So what we've been able to do is use a proprietary camera system, put it on a vehicle, travel down the street, and allow transit agencies and DOTs to keep dedicated bus lanes clear. So one thing that we've heard from transit agencies is they're putting a lot of money into invest in bus network redesigns and dedicated bus lanes, but those systems can fail to produce success and fail to increase speeds and get people where they're going on time if they're blocked by a number of illegally parked private vehicles. So we've had really good success with the agencies that we've partnered with already, and I personally, again, as someone who's pragmatic, am excited to say, I'd like to see autonomous vehicles in large numbers on the street, but I have something that I can do with that today that's actually helping government function better.
Awesome. One of the things that I've just loved about working in this industry is sort of the ancillary technologies that have come out of autonomous vehicle planning and development. And I think what Hayden is doing is a sort of a nice way to combine all of those technologies. So Tyler, back to this question about infrastructure. We keep hearing about infrastructure. President Biden was talking about our former president and infrastructure week, but we actually have a bill now. But what you have is an actual project. 40 miles, you're planning to run a dedicated highway from downtown Detroit to Ann Arbor to test connected and automated vehicles. Please tell us a little bit more about the project, where you guys are, and what's next.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think, building on some of the senator's comments, I mean, this AV industry is racing ahead, but if we're being honest, the government has not kept up with building a platform for these vehicles. I mean, we were talking about sports analogies before, but if you use like a baseball analogy, you've got a field that's got a lot of potholes in it, a lot of bumps. You don't have any ability to keep the fans off the field. You don't have any ability to mitigate weather effects, and you've got a very complex operating environment on today's roadways that are really not conducive to scaling AVs, either transit, trucks, or passenger cars. And so what we did is we partnered, and we are partnering with the state of Michigan to test out this concept of a simplified operating environment. So you take civil intervention, so roadway design, configuration, the way the bridges interact, obviously, with the shoulder configuration. We look at operations and maintenance on a daily basis, and then you look most importantly at the technology on the roadway. So a mix of hardware, so a full sensor kit providing more information than any road's ever had in the history of the world. Off the roadway, a machine learning and software platform that basically cranks insights around what's happening on the roadway all the time, and basically, obviously, ultimately, some sort of V2X or CV2X platform that communicates directly to vehicles to say, hey, look, you've got a perception stack on your vehicle. You can see ahead this far. Here's more insight. So using your military experience, if you can look ahead the next curve, next incident, next problem, our own view is that's going to dramatically accelerate the time frame and safety of deploying these vehicles. So our Michigan project is the first ever project. We're going to be working both on I-94 and Michigan Avenue. Michigan Avenue is an arterial that, those of you know, the Detroit area is basically a stoplighted roadway that runs parallel to I-94, and then I-94 is the major interstate which actually runs all the way to the west coast of the U.S. through the south side of Chicago, ultimately. So this is, we want to do a limited access highway first. We want to show that we can actually control the environment and provide the information these vehicles need, both trucks and cars. We're talking to many other states, though. I mean, I think to the point the senator made, you've got very different weather environments in Michigan than you do in Florida and Texas and Arizona. And so, our company's platform is to basically deploy across the country. Michigan is the, called crown jewel project. But, if we can prove in the next 24 months that we can effectively deploy not just level 4 vehicles, but level 2 and level 3 vehicles on these roadways safely, we think we're about to unlock a transformation of travel in the U.S.
I agree. I've got a question for you that actually came from someone I was speaking with earlier, and they were trying to make the connection between the interstate highway system and how that was sort of constructed and rolled out, and the work that you guys are doing. And so my question is more about the community engagement and the outreach strategy. At what point would you start to incorporate some of the communities that you plan on these highways serving into the actual planning and design?
Yeah, now. I mean, look, you could never be too early on that in our view. I mean, I think, we've got, the one thing that's really interesting about the United States interstate system is it's, in particular in the metropolitan areas, they become commuter routes, right? So you've got transit services, you've got basically, people driving to and from work, you've got short haul trips. I mean, most of the, within 20-mile trips in interstates are very short haul trips. So I think, you've got to effectively treat the interstates 20 miles in, so to speak, as effectively, local routes in many cases, combined with some interstate trucking that flows through. So it's a very complex stakeholder environment. We're going to go through the NEPA process imminently on the project. We view that as kind of a nice umbrella to basically bring in stakeholders. And, look, our goal is to build a platform that trucks, transit vehicles, and cars can operate on safely. We're agnostic. We're not, we are mode neutral, we're manufacturer neutral, we are neutral between the different L4 trucking companies. What we want to do is basically modernize the roadway system to effectively allow all of this innovation to come in safely. And our fear is that without a company like ours, which is an integration partner, we'll invent certain things on software, but fundamentally we're an integrating partner, that you'll see a very uneven distribution of the benefits of this kind of travel. So,
Excellent, excellent. I want to go back to you, Senator. And the question I have in mind, the genesis of this is just thinking about you're coming to the end of your term. And so I'm wondering, what have been some of the major challenges that you faced in your sort of mission to get more self-driving cars on the road in Florida?
I think the major challenge in any state is going to be the trial bar. And the liability questions around this technology and the insurance levels of this technology as they were part of the challenge as Uber and Lyft tried to expand into Florida, as they have been part of the discussion with e-bikes and scooters. So I think it's really kind of the legal hurdles, the liability hurdles that we're going to face, and I think that's why when Florida set its liability limits early on, it kind of muted a portion of that conversation. Because we kind of set, and then after that, we set Uber and Lyft's liability limits at very similar levels. And so that was one of the bigger challenges. But frankly, I was kind of like an insurgent force. Like I got in before anybody really realized what we were doing, and then we were established. And so we kind of occupied the space by force because nobody else was there. And so there wasn't a lot of people shooting at us early on, other than kind of the OEMs who said, Google, please don't modify our Toyota Priuses because our Toyota Priuses are not designed for this. But nobody kind of understood what kind of car would be designed for this. And so that was really the OEMs originally. But today, I think we're in a very different place, and especially in Florida. And I can't tell you how different it is to operate in this state versus many of the other states, because we don't ask for information. We don't, obviously if you get in an accident, we're going to want that reported and things of that nature if it's serious. But I think, what California does is it's accident reporting. It is totally off base because it depends on what you're testing. If I'm testing easy things, it's very different than if I'm testing very hard things. If I'm testing how to take a left turn, I'm going to get in more accidents potentially, and therefore, but you're not going to know if I'm just driving straight down the road. Well, look, a Tesla can do that today perfectly fine. So I think it doesn't tell us, we aren't asking the right questions. And I think, at least in Florida, we aren't thinking about a test bed. The whole state is a test bed, right? There's no special route in Florida in Miami. I mean, to use a sport analogy, Miami is the double black diamond of cities, of places to test. If you can do this test right, if you can figure out Miami with chickens running across the road and tourists who, that don't speak anybody's language, it's like the Tower of Babel here sometimes. It is, if you can figure out Miami, you can pretty much deploy anywhere. And I think that's the beauty of what we've created, is we are the gateways to the Americas. And as the technology rolls out here, it's just as likely to roll south to South America as it is to expand in Florida, as it is to expand north. We're also a state where you can drive 8 hours and still be in the state. And so as far as testing goes for trucking, we think that we're very interesting. 14 deep water ports, very interesting as far as the amount of port traffic that comes in here as well. And so Florida, it really is a hotbed of activity for the AV community. And I think as especially as Miami grows, we grow the technology as a hub, but also the engineering talent becomes a hub. And that only is going to accelerate what Florida's doing.
Let's say the person who replaces you, you're District 24? Replaces you in District 24, newly elected member of the state legislature. What advice would you have for them, particularly in dealing with the trial bar and some of the other blockers to AV deployment?
Yeah, so I would tell them to leave it alone. Let this thing play out. And I think that's the key, is for most states, set an insurance amount and then let the companies innovate. Don't, if you like, water flows to the lowest point, right? Like companies want to go where there's kind of the least regulation. That was one of the reasons that we set Florida up the way we did, because we think that we're a regulatory light state with a relatively good insurance amount that has a process that works. And so why do we need to be in these companies' business when they're just trying to figure it out? And so it's worked. It's working. People are deploying here because of the operating environment, but because of the regulatory environment is just as strong.
Excellent. So, Karina, I want to go to you for a bit. I would love to hear more about your perspective in leading your work at the FTA. Now, there are a number of different ways we can go with this. Some of the themes that I'd love for us to hit are the idea of workforce development and what that means for an autonomous future. What does that mean for the labor force? And so, wondering if, in your time, have you sought to address that issue?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. So, one thing that the Federal Transit Administration is doing is that we really understand. So, the USDOT recently released their innovation principles. I'd encourage you to go and check those out. I think that they're really important. And, without needing to quote all of them by memory, it's really saying it needs to be purpose-driven innovation. Innovation for what? What is the problem you're solving for? Which is something Renee raised. It needs to be done with workers in mind. Workers need to have a seat at the table so that we can start to move that workforce transition with the workers, not to the workers, so that we can really build on economic opportunity through there. That we also, one of the things that's great about it is it really understands that you have to try and sometimes you have to fail to learn. And so running the demonstrations and funding and investing in demonstrations is something the FTA has been doing for years now. We track about 75 demonstrations in the transit space, but there's 75 demonstrations out across the country right now. 22 of them, or fully 1/3, are demonstrations that the Federal Transit Administration has invested in. And so we're learning each time that we do this, right? We're figuring out those use cases. We're looking at vehicle form factors. We're understanding what is the regulatory framework that will be helpful, not hurtful, in guiding this deployment to where it is. But the workforce perspective is one that we're really focused on. So again, going back to safety, if we're going to have early implementation of autonomous vehicle technology, and a lot of that might take the form of advanced driver assistance systems rather than fully automated driving systems, but how can we roll that out in a way with a customer-centric, with a user-oriented design? The user in this case being not just the transit rider or the other roadway travelers, but how does that help the operator and the driver? Your friendly neighborhood bus driver is under a lot of stress. They need to operate a very large vehicle in a complex operating environment with passengers, and they need to, tell them where the tourist destinations are and manage fare collection. And all of that. And unfortunately, in recent, during the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in operator assaults and unfortunate interactions between transit operators and passengers or others. And so can we take some of the stress off of the driver? Can we implement, preferably as standard, some of these proven safety enhancements that the automated systems provide? Can we get those standard into our transit vehicles? Can we start to move in ways that make the operator less stressful? Can we make sure that the maintenance workers know how to maintain every camera and sensor and light and everything else that we put into these vehicles? Do the electricians understand what they need to do in these vehicles, because there's a lot more electricity draw that's happening? So sustainability in the transit arena means that we need to work with the workforce. We need to do sensible workforce transition plans now, even as this technology will be implemented incrementally over time. But those innovation principles say the workforce needs to be at the table now, not reacting to it after the deployment is occurring.
Completely agree. Thank you. That was well stated. I do want to ask a question to each panelist, and it involves one of the biggest issues involving autonomous vehicles, and that is public acceptance. How do we get the general public to accept this transition to removing the driver from these vehicles? And that goes for many different business use cases, whether it's robotaxis or it's AV shuttles. Karina, I do want to start with you, just from the perspective of whether there are lessons learned from the history of transit in particular, removing drivers from their vehicles. Are there things that we can take with us moving forward to convince the general public that they don't have to be concerned about safety when thinking about AV shuttles?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of places that we're really focusing on this. Transit is the one mode of transportation, maybe aside from walking, where we are federally mandated by regulation to accommodate all users. So everyone, this needs to be accessible and appropriate to everyone. We cannot pick and choose, nor would we want to, pick and choose the patrons that travel on public transportation. And so that means, where industry might call them edge users, these are core users for transit: persons with disabilities, lower income patrons, youth, older adults. These folks are people that we really need to, so public acceptance means that it needs to be acceptable to these core patrons. So we're doing, again, back to the demonstrations and investments that we're doing, really working with industry. How do we have originally designed universal access provisions in the vehicles? Not trying to retrofit accessibility after the fact, but how are we starting from the origin of these products to make sure that they're universally accessible? How are we making sure that they're going to be affordable in these deployments so that people of all income levels can do that? That's something that we really need to build that public trust. Again, that it is something that is for them, that was purposely designed, and is being purposely deployed for that. Personal security, we talk about safety. Of course, people need to feel that this vehicle is not going to run them over, or the doors aren't going to close on them, or other ways that they can be injured. But personal security is something that is also really important in the transit industry. If you take the driver out of the transit vehicle, will I, as a woman, feel okay traveling at 2 o'clock in the morning on a vehicle that may not have any other attendants on it? And so, again, that's part of that workforce conversation that we had. How do we transition? Maybe the driver doesn't go away, but assumes kind of different kinds of roles. But we need to really think about all of these different pressure points and really demonstrate to the public that we've thought about this, that we're aware of these concerns, and that we're really working and demonstrating that we can address these before we're going to see that kind of public acceptance.
Thanks. Tyler, would love to know how Cavenue sees public acceptance and what your role.
Yeah, so look, we've got a massive regulatory apparatus in the United States around vehicle regulations, right? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Motor Carrier Safety Administration, now FTA, are all focused on vehicle side regulations to ensure safety. We know more about vehicles than anybody in the world. We regulate them more effectively. We have a cost-benefit analysis approach to doing that. What's missing in the United States and frankly around the world is a focus on the platform on which those vehicles are operating. And I think this is part of the public concern, which is that's great that my vehicle may itself operate effectively, but you throw that vehicle into an operating environment that's highly complex, uncertain, with massive number of variables, infinite tail risk associated with operating those environments, and the public gets a little nervous, rightfully so. And so, our view is the government has an obligation to partner with these vehicle manufacturers to lay out that platform. And that platform should cover all kinds of risks associated with interventions on roadways. And there's nothing about today's roadways that would lead you to believe they were designed for these vehicles. It's just a fluke that they are what they are. They were designed for vehicles at some point. The question is, what is the most efficient way to accommodate this revolution? And is it every vehicle manufacturer should basically build up its own operating system to accommodate those edge case risks on roadways? Or should there be a partnership model for government to unlock efficiency on the network itself? I mean, using broadband or electricity or any other network utilities, we would never have the carriers along those networks have the obligation to provide safety and efficiency. It's the network owner operator that actually is responsible for that. And for some reason, the mindset in transportation is the opposite, which is we've done it, we've laid the asphalt, we've laid the concrete, now good luck everybody. And our view is, no, that's not enough. Like, let's get a partnership model. And that's where I do think a lot of the public safety and anxiety will be mitigated.
Excellent. Senator, you've been at the forefront of laying down the regulatory framework here in Florida. My question for you is more about communities, neighborhoods that traditionally are not involved in the government process. Black and brown communities, underserved communities. How do we ensure that they are effectively engaged and that they ultimately get to a point of acceptance of autonomous vehicles?
Well, I think it depends on whether you think this is going to go top down or bottom up, right? And so I think the two kind of biggest hurdles that right now we have, well, two of the biggest hurdles we have in deploying automated vehicles that we could deploy today on the roads, like that are ready, pretty much ready to go today, is government and unions, right? We could automate virtually all the ports in the country, except for the unions would push back and we would and the politicians would fold. We could automate, the government. We could have self-driving trucking at a much larger scale than we do today, except for government. We can't come up with a substantial plan across states. And so that creates a major hurdle to deploying in multiple states. I mean, I think there's ultimately going to be interstate compacts between states long before the feds figure out how to do long-haul trucking in the country. So I think those are the two bigger hurdles. But I also think this ultimately grows top-down and not so much bottom-up. Listen, when Elon launched Tesla, it was about making Roadsters and Model S's that cost $100,000 and then going down market to the Model 3, right? To imagine that we have to solve every one of these problems, like self-driving is hard enough. Now we've got to design a vehicle. That's pretty hard too. Now we've got to say, all right, well, now design that vehicle for somebody in a wheelchair, and now design that vehicle for somebody who's blind and somebody who's deaf. Like, those are levels of complexity that we'll ultimately get to, but like, do we have to start with that in mind? Or do we say, listen, design for 90% of the people who can normally get into the vehicle with no problems and then go down? After you've solved that one problem, we'll let then when we'll start talking about some of these harder issues that are equally challenging to design for. The challenge the government has is politicians they want to say, well, we're inclusive and equity and everybody's got to be included at the beginning. The challenge is for the companies is they just want to find a revenue model that works. And yes, they're willing to provide Uber rides and Lyft rides in the community to help the underserved groups in the medium and probably in the long term. And government, I think, has a responsibility to do that as we let the innovators innovate. But if we make everybody solve all the problems up front, China wins.
Look, I think you laid that out in a great way in that the top sort of bottom approach. Definitely see it with Tesla. We're seeing it again play out. If we're going to stick with EVs, Lucid is going to follow the same model. I think the criticism there is that certain communities get left behind, whether it's the accessibility community, whether it's people of color. And so it's going to be interesting to see which strategy, which companies go with. Would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to go back to the public acceptance, and I think it touches on what most of the panelists have said. I think the challenge in public acceptance is when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's going to be a human involved in developing that and in making the decisions about what gets put into those algorithms and what gets developed into those softwares. The system we have today kills 40,000 Americans a year. If we don't design a better system, and that includes things like the National Highway the safety strategy that the administration rolled out, all we're going to do is perpetuate the same system that we have today, in which if you can't afford a car, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to access a job, to access housing, to access medical and grocery needs. And I think that's part of where, I'm a vendor, I sell things to government. I can put in the policies that government tells me they want me to do to enforce traffic, but the role of government is to inform those policies and to basically provide a public good. So the role of government is public transit for people that can't afford to drive. It's things like clean water and clean air that don't have a great financial model, right? That's what you guys are doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Does everybody agree with that?
Well, I think the ability for government to subsidize trips is really what we're going to see. I mean, if you took just an hour off of busing in the back end and you say, we're going to provide you Lyft and Uber rides that are direct to your destination, it's probably more economical for those than driving around empty buses around the city for an hour. And so I think the opportunity for us to provide vouchers to individuals in these communities is really the way that we should think about moving forward. They're going to be operating on a platform. They're going to have a smartphone that's going to kind of be part of the gig, I would think, going forward here. And so how do we offer them the ability to take a ride so that the dollar amount really isn't the issue? It's the voucher and it's the access. And ultimately, self-driving is going to kind of grow as a Venn diagram. You're going to start in these 3 or 4 nodes, and then the nodes grow by a mile, and then 10 miles, and then ultimately all converge. So ultimately, the communities will all have access. And then the question for government is, how do we best provide that access? And I believe that's through a voucher or some other mechanism where we're looking at people's income and saying, if on a needs base.
Yeah, look, I mean, autonomous vehicles can be one of the greatest egalitarian trends in world history, or it can pivot and become effectively a privilege for certain class of people that can afford it and take advantage of it. I mean, that really is we are at a pivot moment, maybe not next week, but very soon on that dimension. And this is why I do think government has, as I said, laid out the infrastructure, they funded it, they provide the CapEx support for transit vehicles, but the next step is to basically define the platform on which those vehicles operate in an efficient way. I mean, we've got form factors on the vehicle side that are coming to market, I was with GM recently. They've got a phenomenal 8-person form factor autonomous vehicle that could provide massive transit services. But those vehicles are operating in a complex environment, face major challenges, right? So, and the public's not really accepting of those yet. And I think that's why we do need the infrastructure bill. The one thing it did not do was focus on what does the technology need to be on infrastructure to unlock this trend. Now that's ultimately a state and local decision, but I do think the federal government has an opportunity here to lay out a set of policy principles that are going to unlock a much more egalitarian form of travel in metro areas. And for trucking, I mean, we've got a huge opportunity to change the supply chain in the United States in the next 3 to 5 years that will cut costs for goods, that will open up lots of supply chains between North America. But again, the government has got to be involved. It's not just, with all due respect, it's not just a libertarian question when the government own and operate the assets on which these vehicles run.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, and in Pittsburgh also, kind of taking off my federal hat and talking just from the state perspective, or the city perspective, is that, what we've heard from industry, and many of you are in industry now, is that as long as you set a common baseline that everyone needs to meet, we can meet that. If you're not going to set the baseline, if there's not a reasonable expectation that you need to rise to this level of safety, this level of access, this level of accessibility and affordability, they're going to dive to the lowest common denominator, the lowest viable product that is there. And what will result? Something that is not safe, not affordable, feeds inequities, and perpetuates some of the things that we've been trying to redress. So I think the role of government is to set that baseline, set that common denominator that they need to meet, so that it's not a plus up, it's not an addition for you to have a vehicle that can serve all Americans, but that it's something that is expected from the beginning. And I trust our industry, and I trust the innovation in America to rise to that high quality and not dive to the lowest levels of quality that we see in other countries.
Great. So I want to go back to Renee for a second, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. So Renee, one of the things you talked about involved the ethics of autonomous vehicles given the reliance on AI, right? Wondering if Hayden has thought about the concept of algorithmic bias and whether you all have taken any steps to address that. And for those who are not familiar, algorithmic bias, the idea that those who are designing the AI come to it, they approach it with their own biases, and that sort of gets placed into the technology itself. So wondering whether your company has thought about that, just given the technology that you're hoping to deploy.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a small advisory board that oversees the work that we're doing and that we go to periodically to make sure that as we develop and inform and improve our software, it's something that is in line with best practices in terms of designing out the implicit bias that engineers are putting when they're developing software. I would just say I loved the quote that I think it was Gia Biaggi made this morning, that equity is a verb, not a noun. This is a practice that we're going to be engaged in as long as we're in business, because you can never fully remove implicit or explicit bias, and so it's going to be a process for us to improve our software over time and make sure that as we uncover biases or uncover disparities in maybe data that we're collecting on behalf of agencies, we're finding ways to sort of mitigate and remove that from the work that we're doing.
Excellent. So I do want to open it up. Does any member of the audience have a question for our panelists? Don't be shy. And please go to the mics.
Yes, how are you? Really enjoyed the panel session. My name is Greg Tarr, Chief Strategy Officer of Indigo Technology. We're up in Boston doing the next generation of rideshare vehicles for rideshare and delivery. And the question comes up from a lot of customers who want our vehicles is, where are we going to park these vehicles and charge them in urban environments? So this is a question I need to spend more time with you guys sort of in the city government infrastructure. I don't have much experience there, but how do we together come up with a solution? Because I just got my first pre-order for 500 units and I don't have an answer for them, particularly San Francisco, LA, New York. How are we going to get these vehicles charged and parking?
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So, there is huge investments going on right now. Thanks for teeing up that perfect question. To really work toward zero emission fleet, both public and private fleets. And so, you've seen now the NEVI, the National Electrification Vehicle Infrastructure, National Electrified Vehicle Infrastructure grant that will be coming out from the Federal Highway Administration, starting first with the longer haul routes along the federal interstate system so that we can build those networks of charging that really connect across and address the range anxiety. But there is a real willingness and a lot of investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law that can now assist cities and other asset owners to build that charging infrastructure, really working on collaborations with utilities so that we can work those agreements out, looking at electrical production, and so that we're greening the production of electricity from the Department of Energy. So all the way through. So a lot of work going on right now. It is the use case you're talking about is something that's going to be led by cities, more so than at the federal government level. But the good news is that the bipartisan infrastructure law really provided a significant amount of funding, new funding, that is emphasizing exactly that, of building out that charging infrastructure that's going to be vital if we're going to reach this goal of no more than 1.5 degree increase.
And I'll be, so I will tell you, as somebody who works in the government, as don't count on government, right? We would say government is glacial in its speed, except for glaciers are moving fast right now. And so I would say you're going to find private sector partners. You're going to go partner with the local Wawa, just like Tesla has done or other groups have done, and build that partnership with private entities via leases or owning or whatever else you do. But don't rely on government to solve this problem. It is way too slow to figure it out. And so I think they have a role to play if they're going to supplement, if they're going to help and provide resources for that, no problem. But individual businesses are going to have to find partner to solve this problem. We're entering the partnership phase, and that's, to me, an exciting phase because it gets players who traditionally aren't thinking about this problem. We're seeing this in electrification right now. With when you have gas stations going, how do we, and at the end of the decade, we might have 15 to 25% of all new cars being electrified. What's my gas station going to look like? And how do I add electrification in now, or do I add it in now in order to move forward? So you're not the only person thinking of these problems. Your partners on the other end are thinking of these problems too, just in a different way.
I also would add, during my day job at Tough Strategies, a lot of companies come in the door with solutions to that very issue. I'm blanking out on a number of these companies, but we can talk offline. One of them is Stack Mobility. They do electric charging and fleet storage. Another one is It's Electric, New York City-based company that does curbside charging. So there are solutions, but we are at an interesting time in that some of these companies are going to move forward and others are going to be absorbed and others are going to just fall to the wayside altogether. But there are solutions to that issue.
So as we heard, we know businesses, if you're looking to get an MVP out there, you're going to focus on the narrowest possible target that you think can be viable for your business model. But Karina, to your point, if we're going to really provide a public good in terms of mobility, you've got to think about all those edge cases that maybe aren't that central, 75, 80, 90%. So thinking specifically, and this applies probably to more than just autonomous, but a lot of other technologies that are coming online, I'm thinking about people who are unbanked. I'm thinking about people who don't have a smartphone because they A, can't afford it, or they don't have the dexterity, the very old, those in wheelchairs, who just don't have the dexterity to be able to use a smartphone. How do those people, which are going to be an increasing number of people in our society over the next couple of decades, how do they access this technology? Because they're the ones who probably need it the most.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you can raise your hands if you're working on some of those innovations. There's a number of different companies across the country and globally who are really working on cash payment solutions and how do you turn cash money into digital money for those payment solutions? How do you integrate different, if you are eligible for various kinds of federal subsidies, how are you able to easily get those into the hands of the unbanked or undocumented or other people who require that kind of aid. Older adults are one that I think we really do need to think about. I think about my parents. They're in their 70s. They're not as willing to put their information into an app as I am, and don't even think about it. They're probably smarter than me, but but really, how are we going to address that and the baby boomer generation, which I forget if they're the largest or second largest generation now, but there's a lot of them, and we're going to have to make sure that they're able to move. So fortunately, there are a lot of companies who are thinking about that. Lots of good opportunities for that kind of business case. Again, something that the Federal Transit Administration has been doing has been, again, investing in those demonstrations, investing in those pilots, investing in prototyping to solve exactly those problems that you're talking about, documenting them, and then setting the table so that these solutions can actually scale into broader use, because we do have to tackle them if we're going to really make sure that the whole of the American populace can benefit from these innovations.
Anybody else have anything to add to that? Okay, let's go to the next question.
Thank you. Dave Myers with StreetScope. Earlier you mentioned gaining consumer confidence or how to enroll consumer confidence when you have new technologies on the road, like autonomous vehicles. Are you looking at any type of common test method to evaluate autonomous vehicles before they're deployed that you can show consumers they passed, like a NHTSA rating or a 5-star rating or a new version of that, so that anybody could believe the autonomous vehicle passed what it needed to pass and it's now safe to deploy?
Yeah, so look, I mean, we are actually doing a bunch of testing in Detroit with large, vehicle manufacturers that you may have heard of in the United States around their vehicles on these platforms. I think ultimately NHTSA is going to need to decide for a level 2 or level 3 platform, when are they comfortable effectively disengaging or allowing the disengagement of driver monitoring systems in these vehicles. So what people don't realize is everyone's talking about level 4 vehicles implicitly in this conversation. The big wave that's happening in the next 5 years is the deployment of level 3 or level 2 plus vehicles. These are vehicles with substantial capabilities to operate hands off, eyes off, or extended look away. And those vehicles, I mean, Tesla's obviously in an interaction with NHTSA today, but those vehicles are coming fast and furious. By 2030, the majority of vehicles on the road today will have capabilities consistent with what you see the most advanced vehicles on the road today from a level 2 perspective. And so, you know, the federal government's got to develop a testing protocol around that. I think the auto manufacturers, and these are the traditional ones, not the Waymos, et cetera, the traditional OEMs are going to need to engage the federal government much more systematically around that. We as a private company are not going to be able to say, you know, this is the safety certified approach that the federal government has deemed worthy of, you know, mitigating or basically turning off a driver monitoring system. I think that's the next 5 years. The second big thing is level 4 trucking, which the senator hit on. So I think if you look at TuSimple, Kodiak, Embark, Waymo, Aurora, all you know, fantastic U.S. companies, many of which are operating in Texas and Florida and Arizona. Those companies, I think, are very close. Again, if you had a better operating environment to deploying at scale, and there will need to be the federal government's going to need to decide if we're ready for that. My own view is that the cost-benefit analysis is going to show that they're significantly safer than the alternative, but is that a sufficient standard or not? I don't know.
Yeah, I want to not answering your question because it's a NHTSA question. I'm not going to speak for them, but just on this point, just a reminder for people about autonomy in transit is that I bet every single one of you has ridden autonomous transit already. You probably rode it if you flew into Miami International Airport. You may have ridden it, you know, on some of the trains here. Autonomous transit is not a new thing. It's all around the globe, but it's mostly on rail transit. And so, you know, that's an application, again, as we have some dedicated busways, as we have dedicated other running ways, just to kind of throw that in. I know a lot of talk is about autonomous long-haul trucking, but it's a similar use case of what the long-haul trucking can do because it's on a limited access highway. If you can have other limited access running ways, this is, again, another opportunity where we might be able to see some applications sooner rather than later.
And I'll just add to your question. So what is the standard? Is the standard can drive better than a 16-year-old boy? Right, because that's essentially the lowest standard we have in Florida today. You know, a license is essentially a minimum competency standard. And so I would argue that government does not have skin in this game because the employees in the government are going to move on. Nobody's going to blame the feds or the president for a vehicle accident, right? And they have essentially no financial responsibility really in this scheme either. Who does? Your insurance company has it. A financial they are the ones with skin in the game. They're the ones who are going to pay that claim when something goes wrong. They're the ones who are going to ensure that vehicle is safe, or they're not going to provide their insurance to that company. So I think the way Florida thinks about it, and I think the way Milton Friedman would think about it, is set a high insurance level, make sure accidents and everything else is disclosed in the normal course, but set a high insurance level and require the insurer to know more about that vehicle, and because they're the ones who are at scale, can understand and put the resources behind understanding the code, understanding the risks, and that's what they do for a living. They're a risk monitor for a living versus government, this is somebody's potentially side job at the local Department of Transportation or Highway Safety. They don't have any skin in the game. They're not going to be there in 3 years. That insurance company is probably going to be around in 100 years, hopefully. And so that's where I think Florida has figured it out, and tries to address that question head on, because the trial bar is looming, and the unions are looming to attack every time there's going to be an accident. And the one thing that's going to keep people comfortable is to say, look, there's insurance out there covering this. I always pose the question, if you're in Florida, Florida has sovereign immunity laws, which says you can't get sued for more than $250,000 if you're from the government, right? And it's like, would I rather be hit by an Uber or a city bus, Well, city bus is going to cap you at 250. You want to be hit by the Uber all day long, because they're going to pay out more because they have higher liability limits. I think ultimately that's how we should think about it in terms of self-driving as well, because there is skin in the game for the insurer.
I think the senator raises a good point. I think the threshold question is, should government be in charge of rating autonomous vehicle companies for safety? If so, should it be NHTSA? I've heard the idea that a separate agency should be created. If not government, could a neutral third party serve that role? I know New York University, Rudin Center has done some thinking around the idea of an independent entity looking at vehicle safety in cities. And thinking of my own work with Urban Movement Lab, which is a shameless plug. They are an independent organization that is charged with working with tech companies and city government in ensuring that they both have come to a mutual understanding about what each other needs to have a successful partnership. So all great questions that I think we need to address when it comes to autonomous vehicles. I am afraid we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our panelists for the great contributions to this discussion, and looking forward to seeing everyone at the reception. Thank you.